Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video I'm going to try and answer a question that many people have. What is a tritone substitution? And when would you use it? What's it all about? It sounds like something incredibly complicated. So let me see if I can break it down in a way that makes sense. So the first thing to say about a tritone substitution is that a tritone substitution is a non-diatonic chord. So what do I mean by that? Well, a diatonic chord is a chord that comes inside a key. So if I'm in the key of C major, I'm using the scale of C major, and I make chords on each note of that scale by adding a third and a fifth above the root note, the bottom note. I get this chord is chord 1 or C major chord 2 or a D minor chord 3 or an E minor chord 4 or an F major chord 5 or a G major chord 6 or an A minor chord 7 or a B diminished chord, and then I'm back to where I started. So those are the diatonic chords in the key of C major. They use the notes of the key signature, which is no sharps, no flats. But sometimes you want to add a bit of colour, bit of flavour to a piece of music, and you might use a non-diatonic chord. In other words, a chord that uses notes that are not in the scale of C major, but the chord somehow works. It sometimes has a function in relation to the key of C major. So that's the first confusion, because people look at these sort of chords and they go, oh, well, it's not using the notes of the scale of C major, it must be in some other key. Well, yes and no, but the point is it's a non-diatonic chord. It's not using the notes of the scale of C major, but the point is this, it has a function in the key of C major, which is what we'll go on and talk about in a moment. So it works in C major, even though it's using notes that don't belong to C major, but because it's using notes that don't belong to C major, it's adding a bit of colour, bit of spice to the music, which is why it's such a useful chord to use. So that's the first thing, it's a non-diatonic chord. Okay, let's think about this word tritone. I mean, what does tritone mean? Well, tri is 3, so tritone is 3 tones. All right, so if C to C sharp is a semitone, or what's sometimes called a half step, well, C to D is a tone or a whole step. So if I put 3 of these tones or 3 of these whole steps together, what do I get? If I start on C, well, one whole step or one tone takes me to D, another whole step or another tone takes me to E, and another whole tone or whole step takes me to F sharp. So 1, 2, 3 tones. So C to F sharp is a tritone. So then now we know what a tritone is. You start on a note, and if you go 3 tones away from it, you're dealing with a tritone. Sometimes people know the tritone as an augmented fourth or as a diminished fifth. So much of this depends on, which tradition you've come through in your learning of music. But if it's C to F sharp, it's an augmented fourth. If you've notated it differently as C to G flat, it's a diminished fifth. Either way, it's a tritone. And it's interesting that back in medieval days, when people were very superstitious, they talked about the tritone as the devil in music. I think it just has such a haunting sound, doesn't it? When you go around in tritones, it's a very haunting sound, and I think they thought there was something a bit sinister about it, so they thought it must represent the devil in music. So there we are. So it's been around for a long time, causing its own history of trouble. But as you can hear, it's a very powerful interval, and tritones normally have a resolution. They pull in a particular direction. So if I have C and F sharp, quite often they kind of pull outwards. So the C falls to B and the F sharp rises to G. So you can hear that tritone has a resolution. If I call it C to G flat, often it pulls the other way. So the C pulls up to D flat and the G flat pulls down to F. So I get that. Now when you hear a tritone like that, it kind of has a context that we're familiar with. We've sort of heard that sort of thing happening. So it's possible to have a tritone that, even though it sounds a bit stark and a bit sinister, you can kind of resolve it in one of those ways. Okay, well, we're gradually kind of building up to what the chord is about. But before we get to that, well, why is it called a substitution? Well, what's it substituting? Well, let's think about this for a moment. If I was in the key of C major and I wanted to put a chord before a C major chord, quite often I would put a G7 chord, or what we sometimes call a 5-7 chord, because it's a really good chord to put before chord 1 in C major or a C major chord, because it kind of pulls you on there. So if I go G7 and then C major, that's a really good, strong move. And inside that G7 is this tritone. You hear that tritone? And it's kind of pulling me into a resolution. So that 5-7 to 1, or that G7 to C, is a progression that it comes up in music of all styles and all periods. So it's great. So if we get to what would be a tritone substitution in C major, let me tell you that the chord would be D flat 7. Huh? Now, you might be thinking, why would I want to use a D flat 7 chord when I'm in C major? Well, remember what we said about it's a non-diatonic chord. So even D flat, you immediately think, well, D flat isn't in the key of C major. No, because it's a non-diatonic chord. Okay, now why would I want to use a D flat 7 as some kind of substitution for a G7? Because we're really happy with our G7 going to C, aren't we? But I mean, it gets used a lot, and sometimes we might think, oh, another G7 going to a C. Could I vary that G7, do something else? Well, let's have a think about how that D flat 7 could be a substitute for a G7. And there's two kind of reasons really. And the first is this: inside any dominant seventh, you've always got a tritone. So when we did that G7, remember we talked about the tritone, didn't we? B to F, there's a tritone in there. And any of these intervals, or any interval in music in fact, can be inverted. In other words, you can turn it upside down. So if I've got B at the bottom and F at the top, I could turn that upside down, couldn't I? So I could call it F and B. And if I turn it upside down, so B to F turns upside down to F to B, I could also say that that B is also called C flat, because every note has more than one name. I can call that B, but I can also call it C flat because it's a semitone below C. So if I have a D flat 7 chord, can you see what's happening? It's using the same tritone as that G7 chord, even though it's been inverted. I had this in the G7, and now I've inverted it, and I've got that in the D flat 7. And if I call it C flat instead of B, it still sounds the same. But you see what I've done? I've taken the tritone out of the 5-7, the G7, I've turned it upside down and then said, oh, there's a tritone inside a D flat 7. So that's how that works. It's about the inversion of that tritone. They kind of belong to each other. And it's also interesting that I was talking about a G7 chord and now I'm talking about a D flat 7 chord. It's also interesting that D flat is a tritone away from G. If I've got G and then I go to D flat, that's a tritone. 1 tone, 2 tones, 3 tones. So you see how this tritone thing plays out in two different ways, really. Okay, so what's the easiest way to find the tritone substitution chord in any given key? Because you could use the information that we've just shared together, but you might be thinking, oh my goodness, so I've got to find this G7 thing, and then I've got to find the tritone, then I've got to turn that upside down, and then I've got to call that something else, and oh dear, this is all too much. That will work, I mean, you'll get there, and the information I've just given you explains why it's a tritone substitution chord. But if you just want to find the chord quickly, well, you could do it another way. So let me explain how you could do that. First of all, you start from your tonic, in other words, your first note of the scale. So if you're in C major, your tonic is C, okay? So you start with C, the tonic, the first note of the scale, and then you're going to try and build a chord on flat 2. So if I'm in C major, well, the second note is D, so the flat 2 is D flat. So either by saying, well, C's the first note, D's the second note, so flatten it to D flat, or think, well, I'm starting on C, go up a semitone, D flat, doesn't matter which way you do it, and then build your 7th chord. So D flat, F, A flat, that gives you a major chord, D flat, F and A flat, then add your C flat. We called it B when we were doing G7, but let's call it C flat, doesn't really matter at the moment really. And you've got your tritone substitution. So do you see how we got there? Just a slightly simpler way of doing it. You start with C, you go up a semitone, or you go to the flattened second to D flat. You get a D flat chord, D flat major chord. You add a 7th, the C flat there or the B, and then you've got your tritone substitution. That's the chord that's going to replace your G7 or your 5/7. And by the way, it works exactly the same in minor keys as it does in major keys. So if you wanted this to be a tritone substitution in C minor, it works just as well. So how are you going to use it? Well, we've got common progressions in music. So you might have a progression, for example, that goes 2, 5, 1. Let's just put that in another language. If we're in C major, it would be a D minor chord, a G chord, and a C chord. So 2, 5, 1. So D minor, G, C. Okay, now you could make that a bit richer by adding 7ths. So I could go 2 or D minor, 5/7 or G7, 1. I could add another 7th by using a 7th on the first chord. So 2/7 or a D minor 7, 5/7 or a G7, and then 1, the C chord. Okay, now how about you replace the 5/7 or the G7 with the tritone substitution. So I now go 2/7 or the D minor 7, and then I'm going to use this D flat 7 chord, and then go on to C, or could even be a C major 7 chord, you know, and then I could use that and then use a C major 7. Just gives you more colour, doesn't it? Now, some people watching this are going to say, hang on a second, that D flat, F, A flat, C flat chord, well, that's actually a 5/7 or a dominant 7th in G flat major, isn't it? Absolutely correct, you're right. It's fine because it can function as a 5/7 in G flat major. So I could use that and then go to G flat major, or it can function as a tritone substitution in C major. So this is why it's such a useful chord. It's very flexible, very colourful. And other people might be saying, hang on a second, if I've got this chord D flat, F, A flat, B, that looks like a German 6 to me. That's true actually, and it may be seen as a German 6 in the key of F major, because we normally build a German 6 on a flat 6 degree of the scale. So a German 6 is often referred to as a predominant chord. So if we had that as a German 6 in the key of F, it would usually resolve to chord 5 in F, which is a C major chord. So it's doing exactly the same as the tritone substitution. So that's quite interesting as well. And of course, you can have a German 6 built on flat 2 as well as on flat 6. So it's all about different conventions. And if you're thinking German 6, what the heck's that? Never heard of it. Doesn't matter at all. But I'm just making this link for people who perhaps have never heard of a tritone substitution, but have heard of a German 6, or people who are not sure what this is, but they know about a D flat 7 chord relating to G flat major. It's just to make the point that, yeah, these things can function in different ways in different circumstances, but it's all amounting to what we're talking about here, the tritone substitution. So, the great thing is there are musicians around from so many different musical traditions, working in different musical genres. That's fantastic. And, we want to be open to all. That's great. So we sometimes have slightly different language for explaining the same things. And we sometimes use the same things in slightly different ways. But hey, non-diatonic chords add colour. So it doesn't matter if you're playing in a rock band or you're looking at some of this stuff in Mozart. Non-diatonic chords are a way of adding colour, a way of adding variety, a touch of something less expected. And as with all these things, once you've got your head round what a tritone substitution is and how it works, what it sounds like, play around with it. Just keep playing them, build them into your writing until you get happy about using them. And you'll find it's a great way just to add a bit of colour to what you're doing. So I hope you enjoy working with tritone substitutions.